Lucerne, Switzerland, 7:58 a.m. A veil of morning mist, thin as parchment, clung to the granite steps leading into the federal court. The wind from the lake whispered through the rows of bare maple trees, a chilling and still. A woman stepped out of a charcoal gray Volvo. She was tall, with squared shoulders and a graceful, unhurried gait, the walk of someone who had nothing to prove. Her name was Magdalena Weiss. Magdalena was a senior federal judge, once described as the coldest blade in European justice. But today she wore no robe. Only a charcoal blazer, a crisp white collared shirt, and a slim leather file clutched under one arm. She ascended the steps. Her heels struck the stone in steady rhythm. Each step was a silent statement. At the security checkpoint, the gaze of one guard, Dieter Bachmann, a man nearing 60 with glacial eyes and wrinkles carved by prejudice, froze. He did not look at Magdalena as one would a public official. Not even as a judge. He looked at her as someone who did not belong. "Step to the right," he ordered, his voice brisk and authoritarian. Magdalena stopped. "Is there a problem?" "Random check." His eyes flicked from her collarbone to the neatly pinned curls at the nape of her neck. "Identification?" Magdalena produced her judicial ID. He glanced at it for barely 3 seconds before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "You just violated security protocol," she said calmly, her eyes unfaltering. He sneered. "You can file a complaint later. For now, follow me." The inspection room was tucked behind the main corridor. No windows. A single steel chair in the center. A scanner. And an electric clipper lying solitary on a stainless steel table. "Sit," Dieter commanded. Magdalena crossed her arms. "I do not consent to any search without a warrant or just cause. I request the presence of the head of security or a judicial representative." He stepped closer. "Who do you think you are?" "The law." "I am the law," Magdalena replied, her voice low and ice-cold. That stopped him, but not for long. He signaled. 2 younger guards entered silently. One grabbed her arm. The other forced her into the chair. "Get your hands off me," she snapped. But it was too late. The clippers buzzed to life. The cold blade touched her scalp. A thick lock of silvery curls, nurtured in pride and memory, fell to the floor. Then another. And another. They laughed. She didn't. Magdalena's face didn't flinch. But inside, something cracked. Not fear, faith. Faith in silence. Dieter leaned back, arms crossed. "Now you look like someone in charge." She rose. "I will not forget this." He scoffed. "Someone like you can't do a damn thing." She looked at him, held his gaze, and said clearly, "And that will be the last mistake of your career." 10 minutes later, Magdalena entered courtroom number 3. Beneath the 10-meter-high glass dome, hundreds were already seated. Lawyers, journalists, plaintiffs, and defendants gathered for a public hearing on police abuse in a border town, a case that had shocked all of Europe. The presiding judge that day was none other than Senior Judge Magdalena Weiss. Heads turned as she walked past the benches. Her hair now jagged, exposing patches of flushed scalp. But her posture erect, unwavering, unapologetic. She looked at no one. She simply stepped up to the bench, took the black judge's robe hanging there and put it on herself. No assistance. None needed. As she sat in the highest seat, her gaze swept across the courtroom, landing on Dieter, now standing at the entrance, gripping his belt, his face draining of color. She opened the proceedings with a voice as cold and firm as steel. "This court is now in session. Case, the Swiss Confederation versus the Chief of Police, Appenzell District. Charges, abuse of power, violence, and violation of human rights. Prosecution present?" "Present, Your Honor." "Defense?" "Present." Magdalena opened the case file. Her eyes did not blink. Today, justice was not merely served. It was rewritten. After declaring the court in session, Magdalena sat still. She listened to the first testimonies as if they were echoing from somewhere far away, muffled through a thick pane of glass between her and the world. But in truth, she heard everything, every detail, every breath, like a musician poised in silence, waiting for the precise moment to release a decisive note. On the witness stand, the first officer, Lieutenant Marcus Engel, delivered his testimony. He asserted that the crowd control measures taken in Appenzell that February had followed proper tactical protocol. "And who gave the order to fire rubber bullets at unarmed protesters?" the prosecution lawyer asked. "We determined their behavior was threatening." Magdalena interjected. "Is there any camera footage documenting this threatening behavior, Lieutenant Engel?" "No, Your Honor. But the danger was clearly perceptible in their actions." "Perception is not evidence," Magdalena said, her voice as firm as a steel door sliding shut. Marcus Engel lowered his head, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt. Halfway through the session, Magdalena called a 15-minute recess. As the room emptied, she remained seated, hands interlaced, eyes quietly fixed on the far door where Dieter Bachmann, the man who had humiliated her that morning, tried to disappear into the background. "Mr. Bachmann," she said without looking up. He jolted. So did the room. "Step forward," she ordered. He approached, his gait unsteady. "How long have you worked in this court?" 22 years, Your Honor." "And in those 22 years, have you ever been the subject of a complaint?" I'm not sure. Nothing formal." Magdalena tilted her head as if examining a rare pathology under a microscope. "Did you know who I was when you shaved my head this morning?" "No, Your Honor." "So, if I hadn't been Judge Weiss, would what happened still have occurred?" Silence. "That," Magdalena said slowly, "is the most frightening part of all this, Mr. Bachmann. Not that you didn't know who I was, but that you believed I couldn't be anyone at all." Dieter didn't respond. He didn't have to. Guilt hung over him like a sentence not yet read. That afternoon, in the corridor between courtrooms, a woman in a tailored suit approached Magdalena just as she was returning to her chambers. She was around 40 with cropped blonde hair, an athletic build, and eyes sharp as cut glass. "Judge Weiss," the woman said. "I'm Clara Bruckner, Internal Affairs Agent with the Office of Judicial Integrity." Magdalena stopped. "Is there an issue?" Clara handed her a badge and a sealed brown envelope. "We received an anonymous internal complaint. This file contains civil and internal grievances ignored over the past 10 years, including at least 14 involving Mr. Dieter Bachmann. All dismissed. Not a single one advanced to formal investigation," Clara said crisply. "That's why we need your cooperation." Magdalena opened the file. Each page bore a name. A buried story. A single thought passed through her mind. Every rotten system is protected by doors locked from the inside. She looked at Clara. "I won't just cooperate. I'll lead." That night, in her 8th-floor apartment near the river, Magdalena turned on a low desk lamp. In front of her lay the file of the first victim on the list, Julian Farkas, a final-year law student once assaulted in the court lobby for noncompliance. Complaint, unreceived. Officer involved, Dieter Bachmann. Julian had never returned to pursue law. Magdalena picked up the phone. "Julian? This is Magdalena Weiss. I'd like to invite you to the court not for an apology but to restart justice." On the other end, after a long silence, a voice cracked softly. "Yes." The next morning, as new witnesses took the stand, Magdalena knew she no longer sat as a mere interpreter of law. She sat as someone whose hair had been stripped away by the very system she once represented and who had come back to repair it. Courtroom number 3 was lit by radiant sunlight. Beams filtered through the glass dome, casting long streaks across the witness benches. The atmosphere was oddly still, as if the courthouse itself was listening. Magdalena Weiss entered from the side door, slowly and without her robe. She wore a white shirt, her hair still ragged, unapologetically exposed. A faint new scar at her temple, mark of that fateful morning, remained, straight and unhidden. A special judicial panel had been convened to hear new witnesses, those ignored for years, now brought forward after Magdalena and Agent Clara Bruckner reopened the suppressed records. "This is a special examination session," Magdalena announced. "Under the emergency provisions of the Judicial Integrity Act, invoked in cases of suspected abuse concealment within law enforcement institutions." A ripple spread through the room. Not all agreed, but no one objected. The first witness was Julian Farkas. He was around 30, dressed in a worn but tidy suit, his hands slightly trembling as he took the oath. His face bore the quiet scars of someone crushed by something formless and who had taken a decade to gather the strength to return. "Mr. Farkas," Magdalena asked, "can you recount what happened to you on October 14, 2013? Julian nodded, his voice hoarse. "I was a judicial intern, present to assist in record-keeping for a lead attorney. As I passed through security, an officer, Bachmann, asked me to stop and open my bag. Did you comply?" "I did." I showed him my laptop. But when I asked why I was being checked and not the others ahead of me, he said, "Don't ask stupid questions. Immigrants don't get to demand fairness." A quiet hiss came from the press benches. "And then?" Magdalena asked, expression unchanged. Julian looked at his hands. I objected. Not loudly. Just said I'd file a complaint. He shoved me into a wall. I hit my head. No one intervened. The record keeper that day was Judge Mahler's personal clerk. But the record vanished. "Medical report?" "I still have it," Julian said, handing over a copy. "Diagnosis, minor concussion, nasal fracture, hairline cheekbone fracture. No CCTV camera malfunction," they said. Magdalena took the paper. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. But she held it like an inked verdict. Next was Elizabeth Trostel, former court secretary who had worked under multiple judges for over 15 years. She had been the one to spark the reopening of Bachmann's file. Ms. Trostel, the prosecution asked, were you ever instructed to delete or alter internal complaints? Yes, she said. I was directed to by Chief Justice Mahler at the time. Specifically, in 2017 there were 3 consecutive complaints against Bachmann by interns. One was touched, one called a bar girl, and one was pulled into a private room. I was told to log them but mark them as handled internally. How were they handled? Elizabeth looked directly at Magdalena. They weren't. Everyone knew. No one spoke. The final witness that day was an elderly woman named Marina Kohler, 68, with brown skin and slow German. I don't remember the exact year. But it was winter, she said. I came to testify for a neighbor in a land seizure case. I brought documents, copies of the contract, and photos. They wouldn't let me through the gate. They said I forged papers. An old, bald security guard grabbed my bag and tore everything up. Do you know his name? Magdalena asked. I do now, she said. Dieter Bachmann. Magdalena sat upright. The room tensed like a drawn bow. When I protested, Marina continued, her voice soft but sharp, he said. You should be grateful it was just your papers. Others get dragged away. A hushed, oh my God, slipped from the press rows. Magdalena rose. 3 witnesses. 3 different stories. 3 different years. One common name. She looked down at the judicial bench where some judges could no longer meet her gaze. And that's only the surface. So I ask again, who authorized Bachmann's continued employment for over 2 decades without accountability? Who said, keep it quiet to protect the court's image? Who allowed the seat of justice to become a pedestal for the corrupt? No answer. Very well, Magdalena said softly. Tomorrow I will read their names aloud before the public, before the press, before history. She took the list from Clara, over 30 names. Each one had chosen to protect the system's face rather than the people it crushed. Magdalena stepped down from the bench. Behind her, the last light of day shone through the scar on her forehead like a fine crack in glass. But through it, the light poured in. That morning, courtroom number 3 blazed with sunlight. Rays streamed through the panes of the glass dome, casting long shadows across the rows of witness benches. The air was strangely still, as if the building itself were listening. Magdalena Weiss entered through the side door, walking slowly without her judicial robe. She wore a plain white shirt. Her hair remained uneven, chopped short as the day before, unhidden, untouched. A faint new scar traced her temple, a mark from that fateful morning, still there, straight and unapologetic. The court had convened a special session to question new witnesses, those long ignored, now stepping into the light after Magdalena and Internal Affairs agent Clara Bruckner reopened old files. This is an extended hearing, Magdalena declared. Conducted under the emergency provisions of the Judicial Integrity Act, invoked in cases of suspected abuse concealment within law enforcement and judicial systems. A murmur ran through the room. Not everyone agreed, but no one objected. The first witness to enter was Julian Farkas. He was about 30, dressed in an old but neat suit, his hands slightly trembling as he was sworn in. His face bore the quiet erosion of someone crushed by something formless and who had taken a decade to find the strength to return. Mr. Farkas, Magdalena asked, can you recount what happened to you on October 14, 2013? Julian nodded, his voice rough. I was a judicial intern at the time, present at court to assist with record-keeping for the lead attorney. When I passed through security, an officer, Bachmann, asked me to stop and open my bag. And did you comply? I did. I opened my bag, showed him my laptop. But when I asked why I was being searched and not the people before me, he said, don't ask stupid questions. Immigrants don't have the right to demand fairness. A quiet gasp slipped from the press gallery. And then, Magdalena continued, her expression unreadable. Julian looked down at his hands. I objected. Not loudly. I simply said I would file a complaint. He shoved me against the wall. I hit my head. No one stepped in. The clerk recording that day was the personal assistant to Judge Mahler. But the report vanished. Hospital records? I still have them, Julian said, pulling out a copy. Diagnosis, mild concussion, nasal fracture, cheekbone fissure. No CCTV footage said the cameras were malfunctioning. Magdalena accepted the papers. She didn't need to read them. She already knew. But she held them like a verdict written in ink. Next was Elizabeth Trostel, former court secretary. She had worked under multiple judges for over 15 years. She was the whistleblower who had reopened the complaints against Bachmann. Ms. Trostel, the prosecution asked, were you ever instructed to erase or alter internal complaints? Yes, she answered. I was instructed to do so by Chief Justice Mahler while he was still in office. Can you be specific? In 2017, there were 3 consecutive complaints against Bachmann from interns. One was touched, one was called a bar girl, and one was pulled into a private room. I was told to log the complaints but mark them as handled internally. And how were they handled? Elizabeth looked directly at Magdalena. They weren't. Everyone knew. But no one spoke. The final witness that day was an elderly woman named Marina Kohler, 68, with brown skin and a slow, careful German. I don't remember the exact year, she said softly, but it was winter. I came to testify for a neighbor whose land was being forcibly taken. I brought documents, contract copies, and photographs. They wouldn't let me through the gate. They said the papers were fake. A bald, older guard grabbed my bag and tore them up. Do you know his name? Magdalena asked. I do now, she said. Dieter Bachmann. Magdalena straightened. The entire courtroom tightened like a drawn bow. And when I protested, Marina continued, her voice quiet but sharp. He said, you should feel lucky it was just the papers. Others get dragged off. A stunned, oh my God, slipped from the press row. Magdalena rose to her feet. 3 witnesses. 3 different stories. 3 separate years. 1 common name. She looked down at the judicial bench where a few judges could no longer raise their eyes to meet hers. And this is just the surface. So I ask again, who signed off on Bachmann's continued employment for over 2 decades without consequence? Who said stay quiet to protect the image? Who allowed the seat of justice to become a pedestal for the unjust? Silence. Very well, Magdalena said quietly. Tomorrow I will read aloud the names of those responsible before the public, before the press, and before history. She took the list from Clara's hand, over 30 names. Each one had chosen to protect the institution's facade instead of the lives it crushed. Magdalena stepped down from the bench. Behind her, the last light of day cut through the scar on her forehead like a hairline crack in a pane of glass. But through that crack, light poured in. The next day, the federal court of Lucerne wasn't just full. It was full of eyes. From journalists and law students to those who had once filed complaints in vain, everyone was present. Outside, banners began to appear across the square facing the courthouse. On white cloth, bold black letters read, "No one above the law. We were silenced too. We stand with Judge Weiss." Inside her private office, Magdalena Weiss put on her black robe earlier than usual. Light from the tall window fell across her cropped hair, highlighting the scar that had not yet faded. In front of her was a printed list on thick paper, each name typed clearly, accompanied by dates, signatures, and the decisions to ignore complaints. She didn't need to reread it. She had memorized every name. 8:30, courtroom number 3. Every seat was taken. Some stood along the hallway. When Magdalena entered, everyone rose, not because they were told, but because they knew. She didn't nod. She simply walked to the bench and spoke. Before we proceed with arguments, I will do what should have been done years ago. Publicly read the names of those who chose to protect a wrongdoer instead of protecting justice. No one moved. She opened the file. Supreme Judge Ottmar Lehner signed off on the dismissal of 2 internal investigations into misconduct toward women by a security officer in 2015 and 2018. Regional Chief Justice Sybil Fontana ordered complaints to be categorized as legally unfounded without initiating preliminary reviews. Head of Internal Complaints Bruno Moser signed Internal Memo 117/B stating, "Do not process complaints that lack political relevance." And notably, Supreme Judge Hans Mahler, honorary legal advisor, once my mentor, who told me, "Justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be steady." She paused. "But ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice even and cold, "when silence is used to shield wrongdoing, it is no longer dignity. It becomes complicity." Pen dropped. Someone stifled a sob. Magdalena scanned the room. "If anyone named here wishes to respond, I am open to hearing it, in a public hearing." No one stood. Not one. By noon, the video of Magdalena's statement had gone viral across social media. National news stations cut into their programming to broadcast it live. On Twitter, the hashtag #WeissReckoning became the #1 trending topic. An hour later, 3 judges named on the list filed for extended medical leave. The press didn't need to dig deeper, the public already understood. That afternoon, as Magdalena returned to her office, Clara Bruckner was waiting. "There's word from the Ministry of Justice," Clara said, placing a new file on the desk. "The Federal Integrity Commission just voted to open a systemic investigation. Codename, Clean the Courthouse." Magdalena didn't react with surprise. She simply nodded. "And they want you to serve as coordinating advisor." She glanced at the file, then looked out the tall window, where the crowd still hadn't left the square. "Fine, but I don't want to sit in meeting rooms." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you want?" Magdalena turned back to her, gaze unwavering. "I want to personally question every person who signed off on legalizing silence." That evening, when Magdalena returned to her apartment, there was a letter waiting beneath the door. No name, just a single page, written in a trembling hand. "I'm the mother of a girl who was pulled from the waiting bench and searched like a criminal, just because she wore a hoodie and had dark skin. We filed a complaint. They said there wasn't enough evidence. I taught her to stay quiet to stay safe. But now, because of you, she's applied to law school. Thank you. A mother who once stayed silent." Magdalena folded the letter and placed it inside a small wooden box on her desk, next to her judicial ID and the first lock of hair she cut after the incident. 3 symbols. 1 journey. 5th floor, closed chamber of the Federal Supreme Judicial Council. No journalists. No cameras. Only those who held the power to define the law, now forced to define themselves. Magdalena Weiss sat at one end of a long oval table. In front of her, 11 chairs. A few were already occupied, aged faces that had once told her with frosted politeness, "Silence is sometimes the highest form of wisdom." Today, they could no longer remain silent. Presiding over the session was Chief Justice Friedrich Lorenz, a man known for his emotionless demeanor. His expression toward Magdalena showed no anger, no goodwill, only defense. "Judge Weiss," Lorenz began, "I trust you understand what's happening out there is no longer a trial. It's a purge. And you're at the center of it." Magdalena didn't blink. "Not a purge. A cleansing." Silence tightened like a brass wire. "You publicly revealed the names of judges who declined to open internal investigations," said Maria Langen, a silver-haired woman who had once mentored Magdalena in her early years. "That act has placed this entire council under public suspicion." "The public doesn't doubt me," Magdalena replied. "They doubt those who remain silent and still haven't spoken." Lorenz folded his arms. "What is it you want?" Magdalena didn't hedge. "I want the council to authorize an independent internal review with oversight from citizen representatives and human rights organizations. I want every dismissed complaint from the past 20 years to be re-examined. And I want Hans Mahler's honorary status suspended pending investigation." A chair scraped loudly across the floor. "You're attacking the very man who brought you into this council," Maria exclaimed. "He didn't bring me here to protect him," Magdalena said bluntly. "He brought me here to protect justice. And that's exactly what I'm doing." Lorenz stared her down. "Do you have evidence?" "Against Mahler?" Magdalena pulled a document from her file, a copy of an internal letter between Mahler and the head of court security dated 2017. Regarding the incident with the staff member of color, keep it low profile. Escalation would harm the institution's image. What matters is order, not the feelings of fringe elements. Friedrich's hand tightened into a fist. The entire room fell to an icy stillness. "The so-called fringe elements," Magdalena said slowly, "are now out there demanding justice with the only things they have left, memory and truth." She looked around the room, meeting every eye. "This isn't the time to choose sides," she said. "It's the time to choose what's right." The meeting ended nearly 2 hours later after intense debate. No applause. No immediate verdict. But Magdalena knew a fracture had formed in the old concrete structure labeled council prestige. And that fracture could never be sealed again. That evening, back in her apartment, Magdalena's phone vibrated repeatedly. One message came from an unlisted number. Just 2 lines. "I was wrong. I'm ready to testify. HM." She set the phone down, not replying immediately. Because she knew. The most dangerous people are not those who oppose justice, but those who know the truth and only choose to speak when there's nowhere left to hide. 2 weeks after Magdalena Weiss's speech at the National Judicial Conference, a wave of domino effects began to roll across Switzerland. In Zurich, A group of young lawyers filed a petition demanding the public release of internal complaint records from the past 10 years. In Basel, a former chief judge issued a public apology for having once refused to investigate a groundless home seizure. In Bern, over 3,000 citizens signed a petition calling for a new law on civic rights within the courtroom, something that, until now, had only been whispered in closed academic forums. And in Lucerne, where it all began, a symbolic change took place. One of the 3 auxiliary interrogation rooms, the one where Magdalena had once been dragged in and had her head forcibly shaved, was permanently shut down, the nameplate removed, and outside, a new bronze plaque was installed. This space once bore witness to abuse of power. Today, we commit to never allowing it again. Inside Magdalena's office, a 74-page draft neared completion. The Individual Rights in Justice Act, a comprehensive proposal outlining stricter oversight of court staff conduct, independent investigative mechanisms, complaint data access, and mandatory ethical training. This law could start a war, warned Clara Bruckner. Some will call you a destroyer of tradition. Magdalena answered without hesitation. I'm not destroying tradition. I'm refusing to stay blind in its name. That weekend, a rare public gathering was held in the square outside the federal court. Leading the march were not activists, not journalists, but those within the justice system. Record clerks, gate guards, court secretaries, administrative staff. They carried signs. We will be silent no more. Law is to serve, not to scare. We need retraining too. Magdalena was there, not on a stage, not delivering a speech, just walking among them. A little girl grabbed her hand and asked, "Are you the lady who had her hair cut off?" Magdalena knelt and smiled. "Yes, but now it's growing back." The girl whispered, "I want to be a lawyer too." At that same moment, in a private conference room in Bern, another meeting was underway. There sat Conservative Alliance members, retired high-ranking judges, and others who had long benefited from the opacity of the system. "We cannot let one woman rewrite the law," one growled. "She's throwing the entire system into chaos. She's doing the unthinkable, naming the crimes, even when they wear robes." They agreed to fight the bill. With media, with influence, with fear. If everyone gets to speak, one warned, who will be left to obey? What they didn't realize, the flood had already breached the dam, and Magdalena Weiss was no longer stepping back. That night, in the final meeting to finalize the bill's content, Clara placed a hand on Magdalena's shoulder. "Are you ready for it to go before Parliament?" Magdalena didn't look away from the last page. "I've been ready since the day they cut my hair. The rest is for everyone who's ever been robbed of their voice." The next morning, national television opened with breaking news. Tomorrow, the bill known as the Weiss Reform, named after its initiator, will be presented before the Federal Council. It marks the first time in Swiss judicial history that a piece of legislation originating from an internal misconduct case has reached the national legislature. No one knew whether it would pass, but everyone understood one thing. From today forward, justice would no longer be the privilege of the system. It would be the property of the people. Monday, 6:42 a.m. The faint glow of dawn filtered through the window of Magdalena Weiss's apartment. She had been awake for hours, not from nervousness, but because her mind simply wouldn't rest. On the table lay the final printed copy of the bill, nearly 80 pages thick. Its title appeared clearly in German, French, and Italian, Switzerland's 3 official languages. A deliberate assertion. This was not the fight of one region, one group, or one individual. This was a fight for everyone. Beneath the title, Entwurf zur Stärkung individueller Rechte Justizwesen. Projet de loi sur la protection des droits individuels dans le système judiciaire. Progetto de leg per il rafforzamento dei diritti individuali nella giustizia. Magdalena closed her eyes for a few seconds. She had prepared for every possibility, approval, delay, opposition, even personal attacks. But the one thing she hadn't prepared for was betrayal by the very hands that once shook hers. 9 a.m. Federal Coordination Office, Bern. A closed-door meeting between Magdalena, Agent Clara Bruckner, and 3 key parliamentarians backing the bill. Clara spoke first. We have internal intel. The conservative bloc is preparing a soft counteroffensive. They won't publicly oppose the bill, but they're organizing a block of abstentions to drag the process out indefinitely. Magdalena nodded. They don't need to win. They just need to stall long enough for the public to lose interest. Marie Fuchs, a parliamentarian from Lausanne, pulled out a folder. There are people you should speak with before the vote. They were allies. Now, we're not so sure. That afternoon, Magdalena entered a small side room next to Parliament. 2 men waited for her. One was Chief Justice Friedrich Lorenz, who had presided over the council's closed session. The other, an all too familiar face, Hans Mahler. She didn't extend her hand. Friedrich spoke first. We're not here to block the bill. We're here to issue a warning. A warning about what? She asked. Mahler looked directly at her. His gaze had changed, no longer patronizing, but not entirely remorseful either. If you win, it sets a precedent. And precedents don't stop. People will start digging into every judge's past. There will be losses. There will be collapse, not just personal, but structural. Magdalena answered quietly. A system afraid of being revisited is a system that's guilty. Friedrich leaned back in his chair. Do you realize you may be triggering a constitutional crisis? She stood up, voice firm as stone. If a crisis is the price for restoring justice, then I don't just accept it. I call for it. She turned to leave. Just before she reached the door, Mahler spoke behind her, quiet but sharp. You'll lose friends. You might lose your seat. Maybe even your career. But if you keep going, make sure you have something no one can take from you. Magdalena didn't look back, but she knew exactly what he meant. Herself. That evening, Magdalena walked alone along the banks of the Ara River after leaving Parliament. No security. No aides. The wind cut through her coat, cold but sobering. On a bench, she saw Leila Okoro, the girl once forced out of her court internship. Now a final-year law student. Now one of the most visible young advocates for the bill. They didn't need many words. Leila spoke just one line. If you don't win tomorrow, I'll keep going. But if you do, they can never turn it back. Magdalena nodded. Softly, but with weight. That night, before bed, she silenced her phone. Didn't check social media. Didn't read the news. It was just her and a sticky note on the mirror in her bedroom. 3 handwritten lines. Not everyone is ready for the truth. But truth doesn't need readiness to exist. And justice waits for no one. Tomorrow, the vote would take place. The result might change the law. But what Magdalena had truly wagered was not just a legislative act. It was her belief that once justice begins to speak, it will never go silent again. Bern, Federal Parliament Building, 8 a.m. The sky was overcast. No rain. No sun. Just a quiet leaden gray like a country holding its breath. Magdalena Weiss stepped up the stone stairs leading into the Grand Assembly Hall. No judge's robe. No security. No banners. Just her and an old leather folder containing the final copy of the Weiss Reform Bill. Outside Parliament, the air was still. No protests. No shouting slogans. The people stood in silence, many but not loud. They watched her not with fanaticism but with hope. The kind of quiet, desperate hope that only exists in those who've been silenced for too long. A few held handwritten signs. We are witnesses. The law is not a shield. If justice is silent, who will speak? Magdalena said nothing. She simply nodded, then stepped inside. The heavy doors closed behind her. Behind her, the streets, the stairs. Ahead of her, history. Inside, all 246 seats of the National Assembly were filled. The speaker declared, Today, we proceed with the vote on the Weiss Reform Bill, one of the most significant documents addressing judicial restructuring since the Second World War. No one laughed. No one moved. No one mentioned what Magdalena had endured. But everyone knew. From one act of humiliation, a movement had begun. When it was her turn to speak, Magdalena brought no notes. No slides. No slogans. She stepped into the center of the hall, stood tall, looked each representative in the eye, and said, Justice is not born in these chambers. It is born the moment one human being is treated as though they do not deserve to be protected. I am not here to tell a personal story. I am here to remind you, all of us here have heard cries for help that we chose to ignore. This bill is not perfect, but it is our first promise that silence will no longer be our response to wrongdoing. She left the podium in complete silence. 11:15 a.m. The vote began. No electronic buttons. Each member would walk to the center, raise a card, and say either ja yes or nin no. One by one. Slow. Heavy. Some looked at Magdalena before speaking. Some didn't. Some whispered as they returned to their seats. For my sister. For my grandmother who was denied entry to court. Because I, too, stayed silent. Magdalena didn't count. She didn't need to. She looked at Clara Bruckner seated on the left wing. They exchanged a quiet nod. Then toward Layla Okoro, now a final-year law student watching from the upper gallery, her eyes glistening. Just before noon, the speaker rose. The vote has been counted. 134 ja, 102 neen, 10 abstentions. The bill is passed. No applause. No cheers. Just a thick, settling silence. The kind that follows a storm. Magdalena did not smile. She didn't leap to her feet. She simply sat, hand resting on the folder where faded words were etched. Truth does not need permission to exist. Minutes later, she left the chamber. No one stopped her. No interviews. No bouquets. She walked the long wooden corridor past portraits of judges spanning centuries. No faces of women of color among them. But today, Magdalena Weiss had walked through like the unframed edition history had forgotten to hang. That afternoon, outside the federal court in Lucerne, a small group gathered. They made no demands. They held blank sheets of paper, symbols of the complaints once thrown in the trash. Magdalena joined them. She didn't speak. Didn't stand on a stage. An elderly woman with deep eyes and calloused hands approached. No name, no speech. She simply took Magdalena's hand and whispered. You've done what an entire generation of us never dared to dream. Night fell. Magdalena returned to her modest apartment. She turned off the lights, pulled open a drawer, and took out a yellowed piece of paper. On it were the words she once wrote fresh out of law school. Justice is not emotion. It is the persistence of conscience in a world built on compromise. She read it again, and finally understood. It wasn't advice. It was a reminder to herself. The next day, the law went into effect. Independent investigation units were established. Internal memos began to be re-examined. Many resigned. Many were investigated. But the deepest change didn't happen in procedures. It happened in the eyes of those who entered the courtroom. They no longer bowed their heads. They no longer whispered. They knew. If wronged, they would be heard. A year later, at the University of Geneva School of Law, Layla Okoro spoke at the opening ceremony. I was once told I wasn't fit for the law. But a woman stood up. She was humiliated. She was dismissed. But she didn't fall. Because of her, I am here. And I will never again use my legal knowledge to stay silent. From the last row, Magdalena listened quietly. Glasses on. Unnoticed. But smiling for once. A rare smile. Not of triumph. But of someone who knows when you no longer need recognition to know you are right. You have become the justice you once demanded. And sometimes, the greatest silence is when justice no longer needs to shout. But is heard anyway.